Howdy, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast, and a very warm welcome to the second episode of season 5. Today, we're going to revisit a topic that Jason and I discussed last season, which is the perils of micromanaging. But before we get into it, as we kick off 2023 and our new season, I know we felt like last year was the third year of 2020, and so I just wanted to see how are we doing in 2023. Jason, just yesterday, you led an exercise for us in our first full team meeting, which is all 5 of us, inviting us to reflect on our past year, what stood out for us, as well as to share what we're most excited about for this year. So I was really curious what inspired you to do that exercise and if there was any nuggets you wanted to share with our listeners about that.
Well, I think you inspired me to do that exercise, actually, because in our one-on-one last week, you mentioned that you were sort of curious about how people were thinking about the year. And I was like, I'm curious about that too. So that was my proximal motivation for adding that to the agenda for our team meeting, was our conversation. So I give you 100% of the credit for that.
I did not know that. So this could all seem like a big setup for me to just get some credit, but that's actually... What a great idea, Jason!
Amy was not fishing for compliments there. That was genuine.
That was genuine curiosity.
Yes.
So actually, that's really, I'm glad I asked because I didn't know. That's really great to hear.
Yes. Well, it was also a really fun exercise. I think one of the interesting things for me about that exercise was I asked the question very open-ended. I said, what are your reflections on last year and what are you excited for this year? And it was very interesting to me that everybody answered like immediately in the work context. So they were like, oh, well, this happened at work and that happened at work. And, this work thing can happen this year. And I was totally sanguine with those answers, but what was on my mind when I asked the question was more of a combination of the work and the personal. It was just sort of interesting to see how that came about. And one reflection that I had on the exercise for myself, maybe in the future, is like, I intentionally didn't go first because I was like, I wanted to give other people the opportunity to speak and to share. But I think if I had gone first, we might have had some different answers. So maybe next year I'll start and we'll see what happens.
That is so interesting.
Curious, what were your all's answers? For our listeners, I'm not one of the 5. I'm the extraneous.
That's correct. Yeah.
So I'm starting the meeting.
Technically 7. Yes.
So what were your answers quickly?
Yes, 7. I think I wasn't counting myself when I said now. 5.
Yeah.
We're almost up to a baseball team.
7. I can't even count to 7.
I'm not good at math.
I'm not a micromanager.
My answer, Kim, was that the lesson that I took away from last year was that in order to grow the team, we needed to build some foundational support. When we had a team member go out on parental leave and all necessary supports weren't in place, it was created a lot of personal stress for me that had real implications both for the speed at which the business could move, but also my personal health and happiness and stuff. So as I reflected on the last year, I was, especially the end of the year, I was feeling quite grateful that we had built up those supports, especially over the second half of the year. And I was feeling much more like we were on much more even ground, which got me excited about doing new things in the new year, because it's hard to think about doing new things when you feel like the ground is shifting underneath you with all the old things that you're doing.
Yeah. And I really appreciate, Jason, you saying about the framing and going first, because I spent the New Year's doing a breathwork meditation retreat, walking on fire for the 7th time, which is just a wonderful way to kick the year off, and a lot of reflecting on sort of looking back, looking ahead, very much from a personal point of view, also work. And so I think I went third in the reflection. So it was primarily about work, but when you shared about some of your own feelings of feeling maybe a bit burnt out or some of the health concerns, and we had a chat going about that we were sort of hustling so much in 21 and 22, at least at the beginning of 22. So ending 22, I think we were calling it a holistic hustle. Like it wasn't as sort of intense. And that made me realize that there was a shift in whether it was burnout or exhaustion or stress or whatever it was, that I actually felt replenished by the end of 22, whereas I think starting off 22, it was a lot. And so I think I share that just with the sense that, as for our listeners, just that we, like any team, go through those kind of ups and downs. And I think you're modeling that, your own reflection. I found that very, very helpful. I also did mention that this is the year I will become a TikTok influencer. I think I put that in all caps. I think I need a TikTok account first to kind of make that happen.
This is the year I will not become a TikTok influencer. I think if I can do the exercise, since I didn't get to do it yesterday,
please.
I think my realization about last year is that, and I have felt this way since I was a child, like all I wanted to do as a child is lie in bed and write in my journal, but I didn't feel like that was legitimate. And I think I did the same thing last year. I really wanted to write, but I felt like it was more important not to write, to do all these other things. And this is the year I'm going to honor my own writing and realize that that's legitimate work.
That is so, I just really want to affirm that, Kim. And I know we're really meandering but why do you think that's not legitimate?
I don't consciously think it, but it feels, I think given everything that's wrong in the world, it feels a little bit self-indulgent to sit around and write a novel imagining a better future. But I think it's actually important to do. So that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. I mean, look how many people are touched by, are you saying about a novel or just writing? I mean, doesn't the world change through writing and expression of ideas?
Slowly.
Yeah.
I recently did a Radical Candor talk for military group that is probably going to be the battalion that goes into Ukraine the American battalion that goes into Ukraine if that becomes necessary. And I said to them, I know they say the pen is mightier than a sword, but if I knew how to shoot, I'd be with you right now. And there's part of me that feels that way right now.
Yeah. I think there are certain patterns in human history, and that is like the changes that tend to make the biggest difference in the health, happiness, and longevity of the human species are slow. But there are some times where you have to make fast changes. I mean, the military is not a bad metaphor here. Like, there's some times where you have to make big changes that cause collateral damage to stop something worse from happening in the future. And you know that you're causing collateral damage while you're doing it, right? You know that there's a big cost that you're going to be paid, but what you're really trying to do is it's like a field dressing. You're like trying to stem the bleeding so that something more disastrous doesn't happen. But that often takes a really long time for like the roots of the goodness that were in that to bear fruit, like for that to actually turn into something that's sustainable over the long haul. And it's and kind of reminds me of like the mythology of the sort of lone inventor or lone genius. Like there's this thread in human history of like long, painful change and almost all of those long, painful periods of change are the things that endure or help the human species to endure.
And yet, while you're sort of going through it, usually one hero gets all the credit for that long, enduring change.
Yes. Very much a right place, right time sort of thing. Yes. History abhors a vacuum of an explanation for why we are where we are. And so it's much easier to put all that on the shoulders of a person.
Yes.
Well, I feel like this is an interesting segue to make from what we're talking about to micromanagement. But I will say that I think the through line here, I do feel like these are about ideas of control and trust and how do we make change. And if we can't control what we can't see, and you all can probably come up with something better to that. But it really is about how can I influence and how can I change, maybe even when I don't feel like I have a lot of control. And so just to...
Amy,
yes.
That was a brilliant segue. Nobody could have done better. Thank you.
Oh,
seriously good.
Oh,
miraculous, actually.
I'm here all night, folks. All right. So, Kim, one of the things that Jason and I talked about, so this I think is one of your favorite ideas, which is you really don't like to put people in boxes, although maybe you do.
No. Okay. Change and evolve. And you have to change and evolve with them.
All right, good. That was a chance for you to do some loud listening. That was my gift to you in early 2023, from a quiet listener to a loud listener. You did well.
Did I put you in a box?
No. I wanted to hear you say no.
Oh, okay.
So
Perfect.
One of the things Jason and I talked about was that this idea that, if I may quote you, micromanagement is measured not at the manager's mouth, but at the direct report's ear. Like, in other words, I might think I'm being a thought partner, but what really matters is how my behaviors are landing for the other person. And this idea that these are really modes, micromanagement, absentee management. So just, can you in your own words explain why you might see these as sort of modes or behaviors rather than a personality type?
Yes. I mean, as an individual, I really want to be left totally alone, almost totally alone. And so if you do the things with me that would be being a thought partner for someone else, I may experience you as a micromanager. And one of the things I have learned in my career is that sometimes people who I thought I was giving them all kinds of freedom and they were loving the way that I was managing them, and they felt ignored by me and they felt like I didn't care. And so the things that I do for one person to be a thought partner need to be very different from the things that I do for a different person to be a thought partner. And I don't get to decide what being a thought partner is and what it isn't. The other person does, to a certain extent. I mean, sometimes I have worked with people who want so much of my attention that I can't be the best person I am. And I don't work well with those kinds of people. And I need to sort of acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that totally aligns with what we were sharing. I was revisiting the conversation that Jason and I had. And Jason, one of the things you said that I thought summed up micromanagement really quite beautifully was asking the question, who's making the decision and who's doing the work? So just to get us all on the same page, especially Kim, what was on your mind when you were asking that question?
I think it's quite simple. Like, the reason to have a team as opposed to be a solo show is that you can distribute work among multiple people. And theoretically, you can find people who are better suited than you to doing particular tasks. So when I was asking that question to determine if something was being micromanaged, the question was, is the manager making all the decisions and doing all the work? If that's the case, and they have a team and that's the case, then they are very likely micromanaging. So from a purely tactical perspective, because I think one of the things that makes micromanagement confusing is that a lot of the time we want to understand the reason why someone is behaving in that way. But I think it's first helpful to determine, like, is it happening? And it's happening if the manager is making all the decisions and doing most of the work. Like, micromanagement is happening if that's happening.
And I think sometimes it happens when the manager's making all the decisions and doing none of the work.
That's a good point.
That might be even worse.
That's a good point.
Those are often called the seagull managers, who swoop in, shit all over everything, and then fly away. Like, that's also a form of it's maybe micromanagement paired with absentee management, but it's no good.
Yeah.
So Kim, that was an example of this idea of maybe someone who's either making the decisions and doing all the work or doing none of the work. But at a high level, can you explain in your own words how you define micromanagement?
I would say that micromanagement happens when a manager wants to control things, and when a manager inserts themselves into their direct reports' work in a way that is unhelpful and unwelcome.
Jason mentioned in our conversation, Kim, that one of the questions he likes to ask folks who are struggling with micromanagement is this question: what's going to happen tomorrow? So, for example, who's going to do that thing, the task, the project, whatever it is that you might be jumping in on? This is for the micromanaging bosses who actually do the work, not just make the decisions. But that thing, that task, a week from now or a month from now, a year from now, are you still doing it? Are you still jumping in? Is that the pattern that you're creating? And Jason, you also had talked about how to coach these folks and just to check in on how they might be letting go of some of that control. Can you share more about that process? I'd love to hear Kim's reflections on that.
For a lot of micromanagers, the reason why they're doing it is a lack of confidence either in themselves or in the other person and the ability to get the work done. And they care a lot that the work gets done to a high level of quality. And so there's a fear that if they let go of control, that the thing won't get done in a way that they think is high quality enough. So usually the way that I like to approach this is to coach people to try letting go of control for a short period of time. So like, what happens if you don't check in for a day? Like, what happens? Did the world come to a halt? And usually that sort of process, which is very much in the spirit of kind of like harm reduction. So instead of saying, you must stop micromanaging, it's more like, can you stop micromanaging for an hour or for, a half a day or a day? Is usually the way that I like to coach people.
It's like an addiction, the desire for control. It's one day at a time. I'm just like, I'm not going to promise I'm never going to try to control things again. I'm just going to promise I don't control them tomorrow.
Yep. And I do think that the realization is often that it does not go exactly as they'd hoped or planned. But the question is like, is it like a correctable mistake? Meaning like, did something actually go wrong? Or is that this person is approaching it in a slightly different way and the results might actually be just as good in the long run? But unless you get some release of control, there's no way to know what's going to happen.
Sorry, I'm interrupting. It's a bad habit. What I was going to say, you said maybe it'll be just as good. What I've encouraged people to do is to look for the times when it's actually better, when people have better ideas than you, which should happen at least half of the time. And in my experience, I found it happens like 80% of the time, because the people who are closer to the work better know how to do it than you do. And so if you let go of control, they'll often do better than you could ever have imagined.
Yep, totally agree.
And I think with our negativity bias, we tend to look for the times when it goes worse. And also with our sort of arrogance bias, we think we're better than anyone else. And all of us, I say that, but all of us feel that at some level.
Is there an official arrogance bias? Because if not, I think we need to add that to the
We do tend to think that we know best, and we don't. Yeah. We almost never do. And so sort of training yourself to measure, like, okay, the number of times when I let go of control, how many times did it go better than it would have if I had stayed in control? And let's acknowledge also, sometimes it will go worse. Like sometimes you will wish that you had been in control. But if you really try to track it and apply some real quantitative reasoning, you can override your bias, because sometimes it'll go worse, but sometimes it'll go better.
I'm curious, Kim or Jason, how you've coached someone in that example where maybe it did go worse, how to coach them so that they don't sort of over-index on that or use that as a reason not to keep micromanaging in the future.
Do you want to continue to solve this problem, or do you want someone else to be able to solve this problem? Meaning, is it sustainable, helpful, useful, healthy for you to be the one who dives in and takes control? If that's the case, fine. Then like taking control makes sense. But if that's not the case, if that's not what's best for you, the team, or the organization's success, then we need to lean on other skills in order to help make sure that we get a better outcome the next time. And that's usually them coaching their team on how to approach the task in a better way.
One of the things that I've worked with people on, if they really feel like they need to control everything and make all the decisions and do all the work, then I've suggested that perhaps they don't need a team. And that has a tendency of making them realize that they can't do it all. They do need a team. If they need a team, then they need to let go of control. If they have to keep control, then they don't need a team.
So if I'm hearing both of you asking some really even potentially pointed follow-up questions to help people get really clear on what their overarching priority is, really helpful. So I just have to say, Brandy made me promise that I share in this episode a classic example of helicopter bossing. This is a phrase we're seeing as well, helicopter boss, sort of like a helicopter parent, but that idea of hovering around, this coming from the 1999 movie Office Space. And this is the character Bill, the bad boss who spawned thousands of memes roaming around a cubicle farm, monitoring everyone's activities, stopping to scold workers for minor mistakes. Jason or Kim, do you know what one of the biggest egregious mistakes was that was made in that film? Do either of you know what that was?
Oh, yes.
I have not seen
the TPS reports. I've seen it many times.
Yeah, I had not seen it either, Kim. So Jason, over to you. Let's talk about the TPS reports.
I think this particular boss, Bill, was an example of the boss who makes all the decisions, but does none of the work. And so he was wandering around and reminding everybody of all the work that they were supposed to be doing at his request, even though a lot of the work was completely useless, like putting these covers on the TPS reports. And the hysterical thing in the movies, they bring in these efficiency experts who say very obvious things like, well, maybe we don't need covers on the TPS reports. And of course, this is anathema to the micromanager who gets all of their power from reminding people to put covers on the TPS reports.
I will say that one of the most fun things I ever did at work was when I inherited this new team when I first started my job at Google. And I said to them, what is the work that we can just quit doing? And everybody was like, quit doing? What can we stop? And like the team's efficiency and happiness went way up. And I had no idea what was important to do or not do. Only the team knew.
Mm-hmm.
Could be an interesting start to 2023. There was a 2020 Harvard Business Review study, and it found that this micromanagement behavior is less about employees' ability to work autonomously rather than the helicopter boss or the micromanager's confidence in their own ability to manage a remote team. Now, I'm not sure that this Bill character, this was the real root cause of that behavior. But I will say that in this study, which was done just about 2.5 years ago, so kind of interesting in terms of the timing of the move to remote and hybrid work. But in this study, about 40% of the supervisors and managers that were in the study, they expressed low self-confidence in their ability to manage workers remotely. And so 23% of managers disagreed with the statement that they were confident they can manage a team of remote workers. Another 16% were unsure about this ability. And there were actually similar numbers reported lacking the confidence that they could actually influence remote workers to do their job well and to coordinate a team of remote workers. So mindful that this was, 2.5 years ago, maybe there's been some increase in confidence based on being forced into this role. But I'm curious, Kim, when you think about kind of this push to get employees back to the office, we're seeing more mandates about people being back in the office. I'm curious, from your own perspective, like how much of this is about trust and control?
It's largely about trust, lack of trust and desire to control. I think that the old command and control approach to management, I think, has been pretty well debunked. It's a terrible way to get the best out of people. It's a terrible way to get innovative ideas out of people, command and control. And yet it is so baked into the way that we think about management, or we think that micromanagement is management in this control and command and control kind of approach. So I think letting go of it is really important. I think there's also there's a lot of other things going on, but another thing that I've been thinking about, I'm not sure I'm right about this, so I want to test this idea out. But I think very often that leaders tend to be extroverts. And I think part of the reason why getting back into the office is so important for them is that they're lonely at home. And I think one of the things we need to do is figure out whether we're remotely, how are we going to help the extroverts get what they need? And if people are coming back into the office, how do we help the introverts get what they need? Because we've got both folks on our teams.
I'm slightly more cynical that most of it's like much more about control than it is about social needs, based on the fact that I've heard this story repeated in several industries, but like it happened to a family member of mine where their office was being forced back to work, but all the managers were allowed to work from home.
Oh, for God's sake. That's ridiculous.
And this is not the only time that I have heard this. And like the more senior you were, the more flexibility you had to work from home. So like maybe paired with a lack of confidence. But if I had heard that once, I would be like, well, that's a particularly bad company. But I have now heard this from many people across industries that there is an unequal representation of people who are being forced back into the office, with more senior people being allowed more flexibility.
I heard another story where there was a very senior team, and the CEO wanted all their direct reports back in the office, but didn't demand others come back in the office. So it was like a ghost town, the office. Mm-hmm. And then because when they had meetings, they couldn't get together without their masks in person. So they would be in their offices. They will have commuted an hour to be in the office. They wouldn't leave the office because it was better to be without your mask on Zoom in the office. Like the whole thing was ridiculous. There's a lot of ridiculous stuff happening around the return to in-person work.
I think all of that lends to the explanation of a desire for control. And I don't think it's not necessarily like coming from an evil place, but there's very much a rules for thee and not for me vibe to the return to the office.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, just to kind of bring that in, and this is something we've touched on before, but this increase in digital surveillance, which in turn has led to employees finding ways to evade being tracked by investing in something which I had never heard of. So kudos, Brandy, for digging this up. A mouse jiggler, which is a tool that jiggles your mouse. Also, I didn't know that was the technical term, mouse jiggling, to make it appear as though you're working when in fact you might be on a coffee break or walking your dog miles away from your mouse. So it just seems like we're spending, and Kim, for you as an efficiency, devotee, all this time tracking and avoiding each other, jiggling our mouses, which is, quite creative, I must say. But what would you suggest to leaders, who are in an organization where there are these digital surveillance tools, or they are feeling like we're in a controlling environment, and they might feel powerless? Like, how do I start to make some change if I'm in one of those cultures where I'm seeing some of these tools? Digital surveillance tools.
I think I come back to some of the best career advice I ever got. Don't forget to quit. Leave. Don't.
Is that the throw your bike helmet against the walls?
Run away from that kind of. It is because in this kind of situation, if people can get their work done in half the time that the boss thinks it takes to get, those people should be celebrated. And a good manager would figure out, what are you doing that you're able to get this work done while your mouse jiggler is fooling me? And don't rob the people of that time. Like, figure out a way how to reward people for figuring out how to get work done more efficiently. Like, it's ridiculous to sort of force people to work a number of hours that's not necessary.
I was in a situation a long time ago, prior to the current sort of hubbub and around digital surveillance tools. And I took my responsibility as a manager to be a shit umbrella very seriously in that situation. I basically said that what I wanted people to do was be very direct and clear with me about, how their work was going and what was getting in the way or not getting in, what was supporting them getting their work done or getting in the way of them getting their work done. And that if there were any issues with the sort of time tracking tools that they were using, that would be my responsibility to deal with, not theirs. And what happened was my team very quickly started producing, because they felt, one, better understood and less sort of micromanaged, they were producing great results, while other teams were struggling just to manage the tools, and they were spending a whole bunch of time figuring out how do you record time correctly for a bunch of things. I was just just do the best you can, get the work done, and if problems come, it'll fall on me. I promise not to let that fall on you. And so it wasn't quite don't forget to quit. It was more like, if the axe is going to fall, it'll fall on me instead of falling on you. I make you that solemn promise.
Jason, how much extra time did that take you to be sort of the digital surveillance umbrella on top of the
really not very
else?
Much. So this was much less sophisticated, and there was no mouse jigglers back in those days, but it was sort of different time recording things that people had to do. And I just said, look, put in what you need to put in order to, make the green light turn back on, and we'll deal with it on the back end. I'll deal with discrepancies on the back end. And it did lead to some very uncomfortable conversations with my bosses in that organization, but the results spoke for themselves. The team was still getting the work done, and we weren't playing the game with the digital surveillance tools, and people were complaining about them so much that eventually they just went away again because it was too much of a headache to keep them around for a long period of time. But it really does take someone either throwing their bike helmet and quitting, or exposing the ridiculousness of the system or the ineffectiveness or inefficiency of the system, I think, to give it a chance to change. What most people are counting on when they implement systems of control like this is quiet acquiescence. That's what they're counting on, is people are going to be too afraid to do anything about it. And that is self-reinforcing. That allows those systems to persist.
Jason, what inspired you to have the courage to not quietly acquiesce?
I mean, I was very young. I was probably 26 or 27, and I had a never really had a bad thing happen to me in my life at that point. So I think I was like very much living in my privilege. And I was like, what could possibly go wrong? Like, what's the worst that could happen to me? So I feel like it was mostly hubris. I don't want to give myself too much credit. But I look back on it, and what I realized was it was hubris combined with a very specific thing that has always been important to me, which is to treat the people that work with me as real human beings that have inherent value. And anytime someone asks someone on my team to do something that I think is dehumanizing, I have like a gut like reaction to become a rebel, which is I'm not a rebel by nature, but I am rebellious when I feel like people are being mistreated.
You're a rebel for other people, if not for yourself.
Yes, maybe that's right. I'll put up with quite a lot. Leader. But if someone on my team is being mistreated, I will be rebellious.
And I think you would raise a really important point, Jason, which is that often as a middle manager, you feel like maximally disempowered because your people are all complaining about this thing your boss is telling you to do, and you feel like it's your job to, but you do have some power as a middle manager. And if you tell your whole team not to do something that your manager has told them to do, it's unlikely that, I mean, your manager may fire you, but they probably won't fire the whole team. So you really can be a pretty good shit umbrella in those cases. Mm-hmm. If you're willing to put your neck on the line, which not everybody is in the position to do. I want to acknowledge.
I really appreciate that story and modeling that. And it's good to know some good things can come from youthful hubris.
I have a true confession. Here's a true confession. Here's a time when I was not only a micromanager, but wanted to put digital surveillance in place. Never at work. Brandy is shocked. I'm shocked too. But
I am shocked too. I even had in the question, like, I was almost going to ask him, have you ever acted like a micromanager? And it seems so like antithetical to your personality. Well. So now I'm really...
This happened after I had twins. When you have two kids, it turns out it's more cost effective to have a nanny than to put them in daycare. And I had a nanny, and there were some things that had this is not our current beloved nanny, who I trust totally, but some things that had happened that made me not trust. And like, when it's your work, it's one thing. When it's your children, it's another thing, lack of trust. And so I wanted to put a nanny cam in, and my husband absolutely rejected that idea, to his credit. And he said, if you don't trust her, then we need to deal with that issue. If you want any hope of creating trust, you cannot install a nanny cam, because basically what you're saying when you put that in place is, I do not trust you. And I'm not willing to leave our children with someone who you're saying you don't trust. So I think, take a page out of Andy Scott's book if you're tempted to put those nanny cams or those digital surveillance tools in place.
Yeah, I think that story probably resonates with a lot of people. Like, often the temptation to micromanage comes from really caring about getting a good result.
Yes. Or
like
keeping your children safe.
Exactly. Like, when things matter to us, there's this belief. And this is the negative side of the hubris, is this belief that, like, if I can't directly sort of control or influence the results, then it's very likely we're not going to get the result that we want. That belief, that sort of logical train, leads us into micromanagement, which is why I think it's important to consider it to use it as not as an adjective to describe a person, but as an adjective to describe behavior.
Yes.
Because it's easy for anybody, even a person who generally doesn't behave in that way, to slip into it.
And it really is tempting to believe that if I were in charge of the world, everything would be better, and it won't, unfortunately.
Well, in that story you shared, Kim, what's coming up for me is really sort of what's the underlying need and sort of emotional context to it. And I think Jason summed it up. You really care. You want your kids to be safe. The micromanager wants a really good outcome, or maybe the person with micromanaging the behavior, not the person, is afraid that they don't have the tools to manage the team without the surveillance. They're going to fail. So I think getting to that next layer of what's the fear underneath it, or what's the hope, can be can be really helpful.
And I think, it can be really hard to acknowledge that you don't trust someone and that you must trust someone. And so being willing to be radically candid, if there is a situation of lack of trust, what can you do to build that trust?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before we close and get to our tips, one thing I wanted to just bring in, and we can talk more about this on our next conversation or a follow-up conversation, is from Gallup, which is this idea that often micromanagers are too involved. But in fact, 47% of employees report having received feedback from their manager a few times a year or less. Only 34% of employees strongly agree that their manager knows what projects or tasks they're working on. And even employees who say they tend to receive negative feedback wish they'd get more feedback. So Kim, that goes to your sort of swoop and poop idea of that person. There's a lot of poop metaphors, I guess, in our framework here as well. But this idea that actually building trust because there isn't even a relationship there. So in terms of our tips, I'd love to get a sense from you of what's one next step that someone who might be struggling with micromanagement can do.
Let go of control and embrace the ability of your team. It's incredibly liberating to not be responsible for everything that's happening on your team. And it is one of the best ways that I can think of to loan trust to your team, right? Some trust has to be earned, but in order for trust to be earned, you have to bestow trust upon your team to start. So remember that by challenging others and encouraging them to challenge you in return, it helps build trusting relationship because it shows, one, that you care enough about the people on your team, that you won't let things go poorly, but that you'll recognize when things go well, and two, that you're willing to admit when you're wrong and commit to fixing mistakes that you make.
A true thought partnership is really a team effort. What matters is how much your direct reports think of you as a thought partner. So you may have to flex for different people differently. Actively solicit feedback from the people who work for you to make sure that you are involved where they want you to be involved and that you are not involved where they don't want you to be involved. And of course, there's going to be some times where they don't want your involvement and you think it's necessary. You're going to have that conversation. Don't just jump in.
For more tips, radicalcandor.com/resources. You can download our learning guides for practicing radical candor. To see the show notes for this episode, head to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Don't
forget to order the latest hardcover copy of my second book. It's actually my sixth book, but my second published book, Just Work: How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity. Available everywhere books are sold.
Looking for Radical Candor swag? Go to radicalcandor.com, click the shop link for coffee mugs, sweatshirts, stickers, and more. Bye for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.